The Banking Scene Director's Cut goes behind the scenes, sharing stories and insights to help you build the bank of tomorrow.
Before we get started with today's episode, I just wanted to give you a heads up that it's in two parts. In the first part, Rick interviews Paul Maskall, his favourite speaker at the recent Open Banking Expo, and Paul had made a provocative comment about the similarities and differences between fraud and marketing, which Rick then wrote a blog about. That blog inspired Chris Skinner to write his own blog about fraud and marketing. So the second part, Rick catches up with Chris to hear his thoughts. So when you hear Rick say goodbye to Paul, don't immediately hit the stop button. Just wait for a second and it will flow into the session with Chris.
To everyone listening, I'd like to introduce you to Paul Maskall. Paul is a strategic fraud prevention and behavioural lead at UK Finance. He was also my favorite speaker at Open Banking Expo, where he spoke about fraud and the growing importance of psychology in fighting fraud. Now, Paul, what got you into this discipline?
Well, hello, Rick. No, it's good to see you, and hello to all the listeners out there as well. It's interesting to me because it's funny because I started in law enforcement in the UK probably about 2011, I think, more or less.
Okay.
And it was interesting because I'd had a number of different roles. So I'd worked in intelligence, I'd worked in counterterrorism, and then we came from counterterrorism and etc. into cyber and fraud. Now, my whole job when I went into cyber and fraud and law enforcement was to sell the idea and evangelize the sort of concept around cybersecurity and fraud protection and advice. But it was fascinating to me because I went into cyber and fraud, and the whole job was to basically go out to businesses to give free advice and guidance, etc., to the public. But it was really difficult for me because actually I realized that actually people didn't really care. And it was really fascinating to me because the people who were at the events, at the conferences, at the engagements were not actually the people who I actually wanted to talk to.
Yeah.
And this was always quite fascinating to me because when I was working in counterterrorism or I was working in intelligence, I was kind of dealing with more offline enabled crime, if you will, etc. So traditional crime, terrorism, burglary, whatever the case may be in intelligence. And when I talked to people, I didn't have to tell people or convince people that it was a bad thing that they should avoid.
Yeah.
I didn't have to say that the terrorism was bad or something along those lines. The issue with this is that that's exactly what happens with cyber and fraud. So what this did was, okay, well, actually people aren't motivated to protect themselves more around cybersecurity and digital hygiene. People aren't motivated to recognize that fraud is one of the most common crime types, especially in the UK, and people don't necessarily see that risk. So this got me down this long now 10 years of exploring this subject well, actually, how do people see risk? How do humans assess risk? And why is it that in this sort of online enabled fashion, say cybercrime, fraud, I would also extend things like disinformation, misinformation, basically all online enabled risk, aren't really, they're quite abstract, so people don't necessarily assess the risk in the same way. So that's what got me down this rabbit hole, and that's where I really started, because to be fair, it was very much trying to convince and how do I engage with people much more effectively in a lot of these different spaces as well.
Well, in your talk at Open Banking Expo, you said that the only real difference between fraud and marketing is intent. Marketing is legal.
Yes.
Fraud is illegal. Very powerful comparison. If we take that seriously, how should ethical marketers and maybe banks, is there anything they can learn from fraudsters in how they communicate and build trust?
Well,
and what
the thing
should
is,
we keep in mind to make people more sensitive for fraud?
So this is the thing. Now, I made this comparison a couple of years ago, etc., and it started to kind of really sort of gain traction because, unfortunately,
It's
and to the detriment,
and resonates. Like
most
of the stuff, like everything that you shared, as such, it wasn't new, but by comparing it with something that resonates, it worked very well. Yeah.
Well, much to the detriment of anybody who does marketing in the audience, normally being compared to fraudsters aren't necessarily on the first thing on their
Right.
list. But what I tried to get across is to say, well, the thing is, if I want to market to you a product, for instance, if I want you to get to buy anything, so either I want you to buy something, I want you to buy a subscription, I want you to give across your data for a mailing list, or whatever the case may be, I
Mhm.
need to give you a why. I need to give you a reason as to why you should be invested in buying this product. Why would this make your life any better? Why would you spend your money? Why would you engage with it?
Yeah.
Now, that's the thing that is the interesting thing, because actually, I need to give you what is essentially an emotional reason as to why you should engage or be excited about it. Why does a car salesman not want you to leave the showroom while you're still excited about it? They want you to sign the dotted line before you leave, so you don't get to reflect or think a bit more sensibly about it. So it's nothing new. It's not absolutely nothing new. But
Mhm.
the thing is that we don't necessarily have the same perspective when we're talking about marketing in that perspective, when we're talking about products. But that's exactly what fraud and by extension social engineering does. Is it's how do I contact you if I'm trying to get in contact with you about a product or market your product? Well, that's email, that's a social media post, that's a direct message, that is a direct phone call. It could be a website. It could be all those different touch points that we
Yeah.
have with communication with a company. But
Mhm.
that is zero difference from a fraud or social engineering, because in reality, I want you to click on a link. I
Yeah.
want you to buy a product, whether that product exists or not. I want you to engage with a concept or believe in something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in reality, the tactics in which I use is exactly the same. But what they do front load the engagement with is the emotional reason why. Like,
Mhm.
why should you click on this link? Why? And again, this goes back to the sense of urgency. There's scarcity. I talk about cause. So context, authority, urgency, scarcity, and more importantly, emotion. So those sorts of things, again, the same things that marketing do. But it's that sort of aspect of saying, well, actually, we still have that societal stigma in
Mm.
relation to people falling for it. So the
Yeah.
language is important here, is it's one of the only crime types that you
Yeah, that
fall.
was the other key takeaway that I took home from your
Mm.
talk was the importance of emotionally neutral messaging in fraud prevention.
Well, the thing is, it may not necessarily be emotional neutrality. So it's very much on the case of saying, actually, fraudsters will front load the emotion in every possible conceivable way. A romance scam, I love you, I think you're incredible, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I've got an incredible investment opportunity for you.
Easiest victims of fraud these days, 40-year-old virgins. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and this, but there's
Let's do
again, it's the
romance. Let's broaden it a
stigmatization.
little bit.
Yeah, but it's the stigmatization around that, and in reality, everybody has been told something that they wanted to hear at probably the wrong time they should have heard it or hear it, and very often that sort of scenario. So it's we realize that the tactics that are used on the marketing and the fraud side, etc., is very emotional. It's then follows up, and once I've got the emotional hook, the thing is, we just give the education, so we just
Mhm.
give the what and the how.
Yeah.
So we just go, well, here's the top 10 tips to avoid being a victim of fraud. But I have no emotional reason as to why I should bother.
Yeah.
So that's the thing, is that there's no real, because a lot of these sort of crime types are quite abstract. It's very difficult for you to conceptualize it.
Mm.
One of the things I spoke about in the presentation you saw is that the due to the availability heuristic, or the way in which humans assess risk or prominence of something based on the ease of which information comes to mind, is that actually abstract risk, and especially fraud, has no real emotional image as to why you should even take it on board. Why
Yeah.
would you be a victim? Why would you fall for it? So
Mm.
you have this sort of scenario here there that actually we're trying to give education to people
Yeah.
with zero motivation. And one of the biggest things and key takeaways that I said, look, education without motivation is pretty useless. It's like
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
saying to you, look, go to a foreign, don't ever go to a foreign country or another country and learn their language, but never speak to the person that speaks that language. Like, are
Yeah.
you motivated to pick up Duolingo or an app, etc.? Well, no, because there needs to be an emotional motivation as to why.
Yeah.
And this is the issue, is that fraud and cyber and a lot of scams and social engineering, they're not emotional problems until they are. Then
Yep.
all of a sudden people are motivated because they then have that emotional hook as to what the impact is of them, whether they've lost money, whether they're grieving a relationship, whatever the case may be. Then
Yeah.
they have an
No
emotional
emotion
trigger.
or a very, very, very tough emotion. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
But then in dealing with it, and that was where what I remember from it as well. In dealing with it, it's not about if you want to tackle fraud and make people more sensitive to it, it's not about pointing to them and don't be a victim, but say everyone can be a victim. And
Yes.
yeah,
And that language is it's again like the typical language we use, especially and although especially in the UK we're moving a lot more away from this sort of things, is for, so that the actual language itself implies that okay, well, this is your fault. Again, you fell for it. This is your accountability,
it's
etc.
tough
And
for the financial industry as well because it's not really very often it's not their fault either.
no, it's not their
Especially
fault.
if you look the recent press release by Reuters saying that how much was it? 16 billion
Yeah.
that may have been purposely sent out in terms of fraud through Meta because they make money with it. 16 billion earned through scams on Meta.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
That's
And
amazing.
this is the thing is it's not necessarily it's a ecosystem societal issue, and very often it's the case where, especially in the victim situation, you have a scenario where, well, actually, like, okay, we will always use language like too good to be true or use your instincts. If you've been a victim, then that also implies that there's something
Mhm.
wrong with your instinctual reaction. Well,
Yeah.
actually, in an online enabled crime aspect, you don't have much intuition to go on. So, and to be fair, just like that last relationship you're in that you didn't see the red flags in, your intuition isn't actually all that great at making decisions. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
I'm going to say with your instincts, like, well, you trust, but please verify. So depending on how much trauma you've had and how little therapy you've had, depending on how good your instincts are going to be. But it's very much that sort of situation that actually that language and the way in which we talk to victims and our public and customers around this is it actually creates a more of a barrier between us and that. So if I say to you, don't fall for something, well, actually, if you've not been a victim before, you then have overconfidence bias because
Yeah,
actually, well, no, humans aren't great at admitting that they are vulnerable to human manipulation. We don't want to admit to that. That's not a comfortable thing. But when we are a victim, then that abuse goes internal. So
Yeah.
I fell for it. I was duped. I was tricked, and all that sort of stuff. So when we're combating it, it's about addressing that language. We've done a lot of work. National Trading Standards has done a lot of work around this in UK. We've done a lot of work around the industry and academia and all that sort of stuff in engaging with this. As like, what language do we use? Because actually, in reality, the critical reality is actually there is a criminal who directly or indirectly targeted you to steal your money or your data and to
Yep.
exploit you. That's actually what happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very much, but also in the language we use. Well, actually, we need to provide that motivation. How do we take an abstract risk into the more relatable field and use much more motivational language in what am I protecting? What is it that I'm going about to protect? Because even when I see some on the documentaries, the media are very, very good at promoting it. But the problem is when I see an individual has been a victim of fraud, for the majority of the public, they just see somebody who fell for something.
Yeah.
And they're seeing this, and this is why I say that especially security and fraud practitioners are actually the most biased of them all,
Mhm.
because we create education assuming that people will care.
Yeah, of
But
course.
also, it's that assumption, and you're also seeing the examples of people being victimized in the
Yeah, we
cold
see it
light
with our
of the-
lens, and our lens is we need to reduce fraud because we need to pay so much out to our customers,
Exactly.
and they fell for it. We didn't.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is not it's not our responsibility and not
Yeah.
concept. But is it like? And again, the open question: is it the responsibility of the victim?
Yeah.
Like, if you were a victim of a burglary, would I say, well, I can't believe you didn't have better security. I
One
can't
door.
believe
Yeah,
you
yeah.
didn't lock your door. How could you possibly leave your window open when you went out today? I can't believe you did that. No, somebody broke into your house and stole your stuff. So there is
Of course,
this ethical morality around it. So
in that situation, there is no one else involved to pay something back unless there's insurance involved.
yes.
We are running out of time, but maybe one last question. Have you seen a very good example of an anti-fraud campaign where they have been using that emotionally neutral messaging?
Well, I think again, I also don't think it's necessarily about. I think having the neutrality in relation to saying without the judgment. So
Yeah.
not using that language and actually being a bit more neutral in like the customer journey, in the friction which we explore in relation to
Yeah.
the banking apps and that sort of stuff, but also the way in which we engage with you as well. I think from a campaign point of view, yes, most of the campaigns, especially in the UK, we've got the Stop Challenge Protect aspect with the Take 5 campaign, but we've also got the government one, which is Stop Think Fraud. So all of it is about taking that moment, taking a step back, stopping and thinking about what is actually going on. So being that sort of kind of semi-critical of what's actually going on. Now, the thing is, I have been a big advocate to say, well, actually, we're still not really motivating the most of the public to actually think that fraud is something that they should actually be motivated to protect themselves against. Most people that are at the conferences, most people who are in this sort of scenario, they're not the people we're looking for because actually they're already motivated for one reason or another. So for the majority of the public, if you're a security practitioner, if you turn to your spouse or your friend who don't work in your industry at all and you talk to them about fraud and cyber, they don't care. So it's this sort of scenario where I've not necessarily seen a massively good example of it. And basically it's just like, okay, how do we make it much more motivational? How do we make the abstract risk much more a real risk? How do we make it that it is a much more emotional aspect? Thinking about losing data, like data and information. People don't have an emotional hook around their personal data. That's why we have data protection and the problems we have. But because, again, it's making that much more motivational to say, how do we get quite more creative, dare I say it, much more influential in the way in which we talk about fraud and cyber, is that because it's an abstract risk, it is not a natural thing for people to see the risk in the first place.
Yeah. All right. Paul, that was much longer than expected, but very valuable. Thanks a lot. And I really look forward to invite you at our conference in Brussels next year.
I'm looking
in
forward to
May
it.
as well for a fraud and compliance stage. Speak again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rick.
And now for part 2, where Rick catches up with Chris to hear his thoughts about fraud and marketing similarities and differences. Take it away, Rick.
Hello, Chris. Welcome at our show again. It's not the first time that you're here. You recently got inspired by a blog that I wrote based on a speech that I saw by Paul Maskall on fraud. Now, could you perhaps, for the audience, briefly explain what the blog was about before we dig a bit deeper in the problem statement?
The main theme was, what's the difference between fraudulent activity and good marketing? Which is what you took away from the speech. And so when you think about it, an awful lot of fraud is actually committed not through technology, but through social engineering and basically marketing to people the idea that they've got a good deal. The Nigerian scam, for example, that we all know. You've won $1 million, just give me your bank details. And then they take everything from you. So that's good marketing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I was reading your blog, I also read that you believe that digital identity will make a huge difference in fighting fraud. Now, on the one hand, I see where that comes from, but on the other hand, as we came to the conclusion that a lot of the fraud problematic is about the human factor much more than the technological factor, I was wondering to what extent digital identity can really help.
Well, what we need to get to is where our bots can recognize your bots. And what I mean by that is, is your connection with me true? So digital
Yeah.
identity, on the one hand, it has to say, this is Rick, this is Chris, and make it obvious to the provider without going through lots of onboarding that this is me. And on the other hand,
Uh,
you need to have systems that recognize whether the company you are talking to is actually the company you are talking to. Is it them or is it
yeah.
a scam? And therefore, their identity needs to prove that they are true, and your bot will recognize their bot and work out whether you are true and whether they are true. And this is a big issue in the virtual digital world that we live in today, which is there's an awful lot of pretenders that are not true. And what we need is a system to prove truth. And that's what digital identities will
But
eventually deliver.
yeah, I get that in the context of a world where we're only communicating through agents, but I don't think that will, first of all, that will never happen. I do see a world where some elements will be done by agents, some will done by others, but you also touched on the example of the Nigerian prince, for example. I can hardly imagine that the digital identity will make much of a difference because the fake digital identity will also say that they are a Nigerian prince, I assume.
Take a different example, which is a case that's well known in Europe, is a French lady who gave a fake Brad Pitt almost $1 million because he was in trouble. And it wasn't Brad Pitt. So, if you have an identity imprint on every connection, then you will have far more trust than if we just deal with each other
Mm.
like we're dealing with each other face to face online. Because effectively, there's no proof behind whether I'm Chris Skinner or you're Rick Kokelsbergs or, whoever else would be involved in the conversation. You need to have something behind it that
Mhm.
proves the truth.
Yeah, yeah. No, I get that. But it's like with blockchain technology, you have a proof, you have a certificate that what's being delivered is what's being delivered. But on the other hand, you also need that physical control to make sure that what's being delivered is effectively what's been proven digitally. And that's possible potential problem that you have with digital identity. I think it will close quite a lot of doors. But if once you are a victim through a psychological scam, which essentially a lot of those scams are about, I bet that part of that scam will also be from the fraudsters to make you believe that that digital identity, which is fake, is actually not a fake identity. And that is also part of the convincing process in the trust relationship before getting into real fraudulent activity, I guess. But I agree that digital identity can definitely save some of it. On the other hand, if you look like today, not today, but in 2024, Meta had a projected 10% of its annual revenue that would come from ads for scams and banned goods. Documents seen by Reuters, and that's a giga platform that does a lot of promotion and that has also a benefit in promoting these fraudulent activities. You've been blogging about it as well every once in a while. And that is where I believe that digital identity cannot make a big thing. There, it's all about making people aware that there are risks attached to those ads or forcing the platform to deal with that fraudulent activity. What's your take on that when you read that?
Well, I mean, there's two or three things in there. I mean, first of all, Meta is the main protagonist in fraud. A huge amount of fraud is generated by Meta's platforms from Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook. And I can't remember the number, but I did see a report the other day that something around, billions of dollars are being generated by fraudulent scams on those platforms. And I think the second thing is around whether you know you're dealing with the person you think you're dealing with. Romance scams is a good example. And how do we verify exactly who we're dealing with, which we just talked about with Nigerian Prince and Brad Pitt and such like. And thirdly, I think it comes down to who is culpable in this process, because if you start transferring money to something that is a scam or a fraud, is it your fault or the bank's fault? And that's where, well, actually, add more to that. Or is it Meta's fault or somewhat, the tech company that's involved in connecting you between your home and the scammer? So we get into this discussion quite often, and then it gets more complicated today because of open banking, in that if you send funds to a scammer and it's not your fault or the bank's fault, how do you find out whose fault was it? Is it Adyen or Stripe or the person in the middle or the person in the structure of the payment? So it's a very complicated loop.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of a roundtable we hosted where one of the statements was that there's no payments fraud. There's only fraud that's being paid with payments. Payments is just part of the process, but the whole convincing game started at the very beginning, which is why I thought that the presentation by Paul Maskall was a pretty interesting and relevant one. Also, the comparison between fraud and marketing, saying that the only difference is the intent. Marketing is legal and fraud is illegal. It's about convincing people in such a way that even a fraudulent scheme is convincing, because they have built that very often very emotional relationship and attachment to that other person, that other organization at the other side of the line.
That's Rick, because I've had two guys who are in my network, Jamie Woodruff and Tony Sales, who are hackers that are now reformed. So that they are now working with banks to stop hacking and to stop fraud. But both of them, and I've had many others in my network, and they all say the same thing, which is the whole thing about fraud is social engineering. It's nothing to do with technology, and nothing to do with the stuff we talk about. It's to do with drawing someone into your network.
That was my point, digital identity thing. Yeah.
So, Jamie, I remember him telling me that he was hired to stop hacking and fraud at one bank, and the main thing he did is sat outside the bank for a week and realized that every Friday they ordered pizzas at 11 o'clock in the morning. So he turned up 11 o'clock in the morning dressed in the pizza outfit for the delivery company, and security waved him straight through, and he accessed their main central computing system. And the way he did that
Yeah.
was using some infrared spray on the PIN code to get into the central computer. Went for a coffee for 10 minutes, came back and could see what someone had just pressed to gain entry. So most,
Yeah.
fraud is committed through social engineering, nothing to do with technology.
Yeah, social digital identity will not prevent that scam either,
No, it wouldn't.
because it was a trust relationship between security and the pizza guy.
So what you have is, on the one hand, the technology, which is digital identity, will secure your profile. On the other hand, you have social engineering, which means that somebody, particularly the criminal community, will always be trying to access your digital profile. And if you're stupid, you'll give them access.
But that was also one of the messages. I mean, I get that point. But for example, Paul Maskall, let's have listened at his contribution in a minute. But one of the things was also like, we shouldn't blame the people that became victim of fraud, because it can actually happen to anyone. And by blaming, you just start to build a blocking between that person who became a victim and the other one. And preventing fraud and fraud prevention campaigns, we may need to look at it in a different way to make sure that we can also appeal to the people who don't feel they will ever become a victim of fraud, because anyone can become a victim of fraud. Chris, thank you very much. I hope we can see you soon in our show once more on a different topic, maybe. Bye, Chris.
Cheers now.